Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. So I'm here today with Mr. John Salza. How are you doing, John?
Hi, Christian. Great. Thank you.
So I brought John. It's okay I call you John, right?
Absolutely.
So I brought John on today because I kind of got into a bit of controversy because I'm a fan of some of the traditional Thomistic commentators, and while St. Robert Bellarmine is known as a famous author on the question of Papal Heresy and Deposition, there is a little bit of a lesser known different school within Catholicism, especially within the Dominican order, following Cardinal Cajetan, and then through John of St. Thomas, and kind of goes into the Dominican tradition. So I brought up this difference, I would say about a year ago during the Castman Diamond debate. And my comment sections were not normal for a while. I'll just put it like that. So I was glad when John reached out to me, because John is known for his work against Sedevacantism. So I'm absolutely happy to bring him on, so I can learn a lot more about the different terminology used. His book True or False Pope is very good with laying out some of the points that I think a lot of people miss. But anyways, John, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been in Catholic apologetics for quite a few years, going on probably 25 years now. I'm a practicing attorney, and I think those skills have helped me in the apologetics realm in terms of understanding, reading ancient texts, understanding authority and things like that. I've written a dozen books, and just really, I'm a cradle Catholic. And as I grew in my faith, I wanted to explain and defend it against those who attack it. So that's what I've been doing kind of on the side. Maybe someday it'll become full-time when I leave the legal profession, but that's, I devote a lot of time to this. I'm also a lay Dominican of the central province of St. Albert the Great, so I'm very proud to share that Dominican tradition as well.
Yeah, I was very interested actually with reading your background in law, because I guess jurisprudence is a bit of an academic interest to me rather than anything too practical. But reading about that and then reading through True or False Pope, you can tell that in some instances, especially when Sedevacantists are bringing forward certain accusations, that you do actually have a very intimate understanding of the way in which evidence relates to the drawing forth of conclusions and burden of proof and things like that, that other people who discuss this question actually don't really have as much of a background in.
When you talk to exorcists and they say how legalistic the demons are, actually, our blessed Lord is the supreme lawgiver and judge. He's created these laws, both the divine and ecclesiastical law through the Holy Spirit's guidance and so forth. So there's nothing, pejorative in saying I'm a legalist, because I do approach it in this way, but this is how the church has always dealt with things. The distinction between what is lawful authority and what is not lawful authority. It's all rooted in authority, Christian, right? The whole mission of Christ is rooted in his authority, which he then confers upon the Pope and the successors to the apostles. So authority, you can't escape the question of authority. And what comes down to Sedevacantism is really the question of authority.
Mm-hmm. So I think we should kind of start this from the beginning. So when we ask the question of whether the Pope is ipso facto deposed in being a heretic, or any of these other questions that are being asked in papal heresy. What is heresy? Like, can we start there, because a lot of
Okay.
people just kind of throw out terms and hope they stick. Pope Francis
Yeah.
is a heretic, or James Martin is a heretic, or Joe Biden's a heretic. What do we mean by heretic, and what are kind of like the different classes of heretics that we can speak of?
Well, that's a great way to start. The understanding of heresy has actually evolved pre-Trent and even post-Tridentine Trent. Heresy was simply a deviation from something that had to be believed with supernatural faith, and that's true. However, since Vatican I, the Church has further defined what heresy is, and you can read the definition in Canon 751 of the Code of Canon Law, where it says that heresy is the post-baptismal denial of a truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Now, if one is familiar with the hierarchy of truths in the profession of faith, which was issued by John Paul II in 1989, you would know that there are two categories, well, not three categories, but two categories of truths which have to be held with supernatural faith. Okay, but there's a distinction between category 1 and category 2. Category 1 refers to those truths which are divinely revealed, and the Church teaches them as such. The Church proposes them for belief as divinely revealed. A deviation, a denial or doubt of those category of truths would be heresy. If you go to the second category of truths, those truths that must be definitively held, those truths are still considered infallible by the Church's teaching authority, but they're not proposed as divinely revealed. They're so intimately connected to divinely revealed truth as to be infallible in themselves, and hence one must assent with supernatural faith to them as well. But to deny it, technically, under the Church's current definition, you wouldn't be a heretic. Now, that wouldn't be the case in the past, but under the current code, and again, I said this started with Vatican I, a denial of a category true truth would be a gross deviation from the faith, an error in the faith, and it would be mortally sinful, but it wouldn't be heresy. I'll give you an example. The Church's ban on women priests, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis by John Paul II. Cardinal Ratzinger was clear that teaching was infallible, but it didn't go all the way of proposing it as a revealed truth. Now, the Church could do that someday. The Church could say this is a revealed truth, but right now it would fall into the category 2, definitive teaching. One must hold this to be definitive. If one denies it, in the old days, you'd say they're a heretic. Under the new Code of Canon Law, they wouldn't technically be a heretic. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a distinction between how high the bar is, right? That's kind of my point in explaining this. To say something is heresy is an extremely high bar. It concerns dogmas of the faith, the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption, papal infallibility. And the other thing I think that's important to note is that there is a material element when one talks about heresy and a formal element. The material element, again, concerns the dogma, the matter of the error, whereas the form, here we're getting into some of the Thomistic principles and Aristotelian metaphysics, substance, form, etc. The form would be the willful departure from the Church's teaching authority. This is very important. When the fathers and doctors go into depth in their explanation of heresy, what they say is that while the deviation from a dogma concerns the matter, it's actually the willful departure from the Church's teaching authority that makes one a heretic. And it's not like the matter is incidental, but the matter alone does not make one a heretic. To be a heretic, one must, and from the Greek, heresis, to choose. You're choosing another rule of faith. So, the Protestants don't have the Catholic Church as the rule of faith. By default, they would be heretics because they have another rule of faith. So heresy is a deviation from dogma, which is the highest level of church teaching of revealed truths. And there's a matter and form component to it when the Church is looking to see or adjudicating whether someone is a heretic.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this is extremely important because this whole issue of these are technically called for everybody listening. Obviously, John knows this. Theological censures, so theological notes and theological censures, is there's just a grade of different types of um, degrees of uh, teaching authority that can be given to different propositions. So, for example, if somebody were to go out and I don't know, uh, have a differing opinion on a certain point of the manner of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, there are still certain debates that Catholics can have. Famously, Scotus and Thomas slightly disagree on the manner in which we speak of presence as local. You can have these differing opinions. Opinion could be more probable, and opinion could be less probable, and the opinion could actually become theologically certain, which means we have all of the schools kind of agreeing on a position. But and then that's opposite of these is going to be heresy. But when you get to dogma, like dogma is extremely high. And what's very important, and I think John would absolutely agree that it's important to bring this up, is that there is a certain presumption that we make when it comes to asking whether the church has defined something as a dogma. The presumption is basically that it's not dogma until proven dogma, or that a position is not excluded until it's proven excluded. Kind of that idea that the church makes it very clear, and we don't demand more of people than the church demands. So the church the church is very clear. This is something important to remember. So as we go on to continue this conversation and ask whether something may be a heresy, or whether somebody may be subjectively guilty for that heresy, we need to know that this has to be very clear, understood from the documents in their proper senses, and with the relevant context. And the Sedevacantism debates, in my experience, I mean, I've asked Sedevacantists before. I'm like, give me one thing from the preconciliar church in that unequivocally contradicts something which is spoken of, unequivocally, in not only the sense that it's spoken of, but also the fact that it's a dogma, is being unequivocally contradicted, not only in the senses which is spoken of, but also, well, I guess it wouldn't even need to be a dogma or not, but basically unequivocally being contradicted by a post-Vatican II Pope.
I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
And in my experience, they all rise to the level of only being suspect of heresy, and that is even extremely rare. I mean, even the case where a pope would kiss the Quran or engage in false worship, that's not heresy per se. Those may be external acts that suggest there is a deviation, from the faith in the culprit's mind, so to speak. But those acts in and of themselves don't constitute heresy. And so all the things that, they throw out there, in their Gish Gallop technique with debates of, partially quoting one pope after another and saying Vatican II contradicted it. I mean, that's their strategy. But if you dig down into the actual text and contextualize it and attempt to harmonize it, it doesn't rise to the level of heresy.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that the distinction before, because we're about to continue into distinguishing kind of heresy in a more legal sense in the three types, but that distinction between material and formal heretic. I'm sure there's 58 of you watching right now. Out of the 58 of you watching, 58 of you are material heretics. And what I mean by that is there are a good number of, I mean, it's not like in the thousands, but there are a good number of dogmas that the church has defined infallibly to be believed as dogmas. There are a very large number that, incidentally, many of you probably, due to your ignorance, not due to any sort of pertinacity, but due to your ignorance, you may think some other way, or you may not even think about it at all. So that's also important to recognize when it comes into this discussion, is that distinction between the matter and the form of heresy that John mentioned. So do you have anything to say to that, or do you want to continue?
You're right. I knew a sweet little old lady who said, well, I don't believe in purgatory, right? That's materially heretical. Purgatory is a dogma of the faith, and that might get into, this distinction, but, between what a heretic is and what heresy is. You're absolutely right. That doesn't automatically, by holding a materially heretical view, expel her from the body of Christ. Okay. And that's where I think the Sedevacantists have gone off the track.
Okay, so when it comes to being a heretic in a sort of formal sense, what are the multiple different ways in which one could be said to be a heretic, like before us? Like if I for example, let's say privately and within myself, I just denied transubstantiation, but I didn't say anything about it. I
Yeah.
just kind of denied it. Versus if I went on here and I made a video denying transubstantiation, versus if my bishop, told me, hey, knock it off, and then I said I don't care and I leave the church. Versus
Yeah.
that, like what are the various ways in which one could be referred to as a heretic?
That's a great setup. I mean, you actually made the distinction when you posited the question, because you said I made a statement of heresy and then I left the church. Those are actually two different things, and very relevant things. On the one hand, if you said something heretical, even if you really believed it, it would be material heresy. But then the question is, have you openly departed from the church? Have you rejected the Roman Catholic Church as your infallible rule of faith? Or do Christian remain in external communion with the church, even while holding a heretical opinion? You see, that's the distinction. There is a distinction between heresy and heretic. And this is, frankly, where all of the Sedevacantists get it wrong. This distinction is, again, as I've said, one can profess a heresy, but go read the Catechism of the Council of Trent. One who simply professes a heresy is not automatically a heretic if he remains in external communion with the church. That is key. So when the popes and the fathers and the doctors all refer to heretic, when you read the old papal encyclicals, or you read the old theology manuals, when they use the term heretic, they're referring to public non-Catholics, okay? They're referring to Pastor Bob, who was never in the Roman Catholic Church, or who openly left the Roman Catholic Church to follow another rule of faith, you see? Now, the only exception to that, and it goes to your point, your first part of your question, is if you held something heresy in secret. There is something called an occult heretic, okay? An occult heretic is one who has formally sinned against the faith. By an act of his will, he has formally doubted or denied a dogma that must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, but he remains in external communion with the church. He hasn't openly left the church to follow another rule of faith. And that's very important. All of the fathers and the doctors, and presumably the Sedevacantists even, at least some of them, would agree that an occult heretic still remains a Catholic because they haven't openly left. So the bottom line, just to drive this distinction home, Christian, is all heresy is occult heresy unless it's legally recognized by the church. Otherwise, it remains a cult. I mean, Cardinal Bio, Father Barry, Van Noort, all of the theology manuals say that even heresy that has been externalized, heresy that is judgeable in the external forum, remains occult heresy, and hence the person remains a Catholic unless that heresy rises to the level of what we call notorious heresy. And this starts with Bellarmine, even pre-Bellarmine, all the way to Pius XII. There are two ways where an occult heretic then becomes a notorious heretic. He either openly leaves the church by joining a non-Catholic sect, let's say, or simply publicly renouncing the magisterium, which all of the Sedevacantists have effectively done, or he is cut off by the church's judgment. We read this in Mystici Corpus Christi, for example, where Pius XII said he remains in the body unless he's either openly departs or is cut off by the church's judgment. So it's important to understand that Catholics often do profess material heresies, but as long as they remain in external communion with the church, They're considered members of the body. They may not be good Catholics. In fact, they may be in mortal sin. They may be, heretics. Here's another distinction that you probably like, quod se, right? In themselves, heretics, but not quod nos, not according to us, because their heresy hasn't been legally recognized by the church. Hopefully that
so if we think about, I actually had a discussion with a very, very odd discussion I had with a friend yesterday is whether we can speak of Melania Trump as a Catholic, because I said Melania Trump is a Catholic, and my friend said no, she's not. She's an adulteress, and she's divorced and married to a man who is divorced. And I said, well, actually, while she's in grave moral error, she's not departed at all from the church, or has been legally reprimanded and cut off for her evil actions.
Yes.
And I mean, so it kind of sounds a bit how do I put it? Sounds a bit bad to say, I'm in communion with Joe Biden, but technically speaking, Joe Biden, to my understanding, has not fallen under any of these issues which would cut him off from the church.
That's right. I mean, they may be dead members hanging on through mortal sin, right? But there's still the opportunity to repent. And there's something else that's important. The example that you gave up, with Melania Trump, even in a state of adultery, so long as she remains in external communion with the church, and even if the church were to come and declare, her marriage invalid, let's say, okay, unless the church would attach, you mentioned ecclesiastical censures, unless the church would somehow attach an additional ecclesiastical censure, which would sever her from the church, which it's not going to do in that case, she remains in the church. And that's why, there is a distinction between the three types of sins against the faith, which don't require an additional censure, the acts of heresy, apostasy, or schism. Okay. Those are acts that, if the canonical elements of those crimes are met, one severs himself from the body. But in the case of adultery or abortion, let's say, the old canon law would have a censure attached to those who committed abortion. They'd have to have that censure, lawfully lifted by a priest that had the faculty to do so. Otherwise, they were excommunicated. But even grave mortal sins, Christian, as you're mentioning this example, don't sever you from the mystical body or the church militant on earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can see this from a number of our Lord's parables about the church having wheat and tares, and the church having, all the mixing together of both the good and the bad, which are necessary, so that the church does not hastily start cutting off the good members. So when it comes to Sedevacantism, I've often noticed that when they're trying to define what a heretic is, because we've kind of distinguished between heretic and heresy. By heretic, they'll just simply say it's somebody who doesn't profess the true faith. Where are they going wrong there with the distinctions that we've laid out already?
Well, first of all, the magisterium has never held that one who doesn't profess the true faith in terms of properly orally articulating a doctrine, if that's what they mean, automatically becomes a heretic. Of course, that's absurd. Where they go wrong is that when the church refers to the profession of the faith, the profession of the true faith, they're referring to the juridical bond which unites one to the Roman Catholic Church. They're not talking about one's ability, again, to orally articulate the faith, because our oral articulation of the faith is really only the material element of the profession. Again, here we go between formal and material. The formal element of the profession is being received into the church by lawful authority. And where it starts, Christian, the formal cause of the profession of faith is water baptism and being received by lawful authority into the church. That is the formal cause of the profession of faith. When we say profession of faith, We're not talking about how I articulate the faith. We're talking about the juridical bond that unites one to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's a juridical bond formed through baptism and lawful reception into the church. That bond remains in existence unless the person, again, openly departs from the magisterium, no longer remains in external communion with the magisterium, or is cut off by the church's judgment through a conviction of heresy and excommunication.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, even the departure from the material element, if somebody is holding material heresies and even teaching heresy, so long as they're remain in external communion with the church, they're not considered notorious heretics who've left the church. There are many examples of this that we give in True or False Pope, from Erasmus of Rotterdam to Michel de Bay and many others who were actually publicly teaching heresy contrary to even papal warnings. And, some of these examples, great saints of the church remained in communion with them, because there's always a hope for repentance. You see, if you said something or I said something, materially heretical on the show, we wouldn't be expelled from the body of Christ. There's always the opportunity to correct oneself. It's only when they make that final rupture, where they openly leave the church again, or are cut off by the church's judgment, are they no longer considered a Catholic, and then are hence considered a public non-Catholic. And I will note, when the Sedevacantists refer to their favorite saint, Robert Bellarmine, when he uses the term manifest heretic, that's exactly what he's referring to. He's referring to public non-Catholics. Mm-hmm. If you read, his explanation of the fifth opinion, which we'll get into, what example does Bellarmine use? He uses the example of Novatian. Now, Novatian was a priest who was then illicitly consecrated a bishop and then declared himself a pope, who was really an anti-pope. He was a public non-Catholic. And this is the example that Bellarmine uses to describe what a manifest heretic is. Think about a manifest heretic truly being a schismatic, okay, one who has openly left the church. And all the examples that Bellarmine uses, practically all of them, he's always dealing with those who are in non-Catholic sects. Okay, mm-hmm. Those who are publicly recognized by the church as non-Catholics. Pastor Bob down the street at the Lutheran Church, he's a public non-Catholic, so he would be a manifest heretic. But again, those who remain in external communion with the church remain Catholic unless they leave or are cut off.
So, being cut, what do you exactly mean by being cut off? Because I can imagine, I'm in a situation where I am spouting off heretical nonsense. We actually had a famous Twitter instance of this, where there was a guy on Twitter who was Roman Catholic, and he was more conservative. He wasn't liberal or anything. He just, was a bit of a overly ecumenical mind. But I could go on spewing heretical nonsense or whatever and just, not want to leave the Catholic Church. So when you're talking about being cut off, what's the sort of process that occurs there? Or is there a process that in canon law?
There is, and being cut off are the words that Pius XII used in Mystici Corpus Christi. It means that the church has issued a formal judgment that you are a heretic, because it has proven not only that you have deviated from dogma in terms of the matter, right? Not only has the church established through a finding of fact, through warnings, and then a judgment that the propositions you hold are heretical, but also that you willfully adhere to the heresy. Internally, that's, as you mentioned, called pertinacity. Externally, it would be called contumacy, that you're contumacious in your heresy. But that can only be discerned through an ecclesiastical process whereby the church warns you, and this is again rooted in scripture and divine law, and this is especially relevant to clerics, of course. Very rarely would it happen in the case of lay people, because we don't hold office in the church. So these questions, Christian, have been debated because of those men who hold office in the church. If they deviate from the faith, the question then becomes, do they still hold office? Do they still hold authority? You see, and so this is where the church says, if you haven't openly departed, There is a canonical process whereby the person is warned, and if the church then, if the person remains incorrigible, which is usually how the theologians describe it, they refuse correction, they remain pertinacious in their heresy, they exemplify a will to depart from the teaching authority of the church, then the church can adjudicate them a heretic, and at that point they would be cut off. They'd be severed from the body, because that juridical bond that was formed in the profession of faith through baptism and being received into the church by lawful reception, by lawful authority, it's that same lawful authority now that's expelling them from the church. You see, so you're received into the church by lawful authority, and if you don't openly leave, you can be expelled from the church by that same lawful authority.
Okay, so I saw and I'm trying to give some more practical examples to show how a lot of this is weirdly misunderstood. I know this stuff, guys. I'm doing it for the sake of illustrating. But I saw a Taylor Marshall clip, and Taylor Marshall, he made a statement about how Pope Francis said something heretical, blah blah blah. And he suggested that perhaps his YouTube video, what he stated on his YouTube video, was counted as a warning, one of the warnings that is spoken of here. So, does there need to be anybody specific who gives out these ecclesiastical warnings, and how does this relate to pertinacity in particular?
There absolutely does. Our favorite theologian addressed this in depth. I mean, warnings come from ecclesiastical authority. They don't come from anybody else. If you look at Bellarmine's commentary on a heretical pope, and specifically his refutation of the second opinion, where some have held that if a pope secretly falls into heresy, loses the office. Bellarmine says, no, just as a man is joined to the pontificate through the cooperation of men, so he's also severed from the pontificate through the cooperation of men. Same thing with ecclesiastical warnings. The warnings have to come from lawful authority. That same lawful authority then judges whether the man's a heretic, and of course, then that same lawful authority oversees the deposition. So, no, Taylor Marshall's YouTube video would not constitute an ecclesiastical warning. And I can tell you right now that Cardinal Burke would agree with me 100%. When Cardinal Burke, was part of the initial dubia to Pope Francis, even he said that the dubia, the way I understood him, was not actually considered a warning, but a fraternal inquiry. But remember, Cardinal Burke said we may follow up with a correction, he said, a fraternal correction. That would have been an ecclesiastical warning coming from lawful authority, right? The very cardinals who elect the Pope are the same men who can issue these warnings. And we go through this in our book, but I mean, going back all the way to St. Thomas and many commentaries on his teaching, ecclesiastical warnings, they come from church authority.
Okay, that makes sense. So when it comes to kind of loop back around before we get into all of the 5 different ways to see if I'm understanding this. Basically, heresy is some sort of denial, which is of something which is defined as being of faith by the church, so very specific category. And then included in this is also not only that denial, but a sort of an act of the will, which is pertinacity. And then there are 3 different ways in which this could possibly be expressed, which are going to be occult, and then public, and then notorious. And
yeah, I can clarify that a little bit for you. They're really the legal distinctions really come down to either occult or notorious. Okay. The Sedevacantists will often say he's a public heretic. That is not a technical legal distinction, because as Cardinal Bio says, heresy can even be externalized in publicly in the external form, but you're not a public heretic. You're still an occult heretic until the church legally recognizes it. Then it becomes notorious. And I'd also want to mention another distinction, not just between occult and notorious heresy, but notorious heresy can be divided into 2 types, really, notorious by fact or notorious by law. All of this comes down from proper church authority. But the commentators will often say that those who openly depart from the church, a Catholic priest joins the Lutheran sect and he now enrolls in the Lutheran religion. That act suffices for notoriety because there would be no additional investigation that would be needed to conclude that he has willfully left the Catholic Church. You see, and this is part of ecclesiastical and canon law. The church says, again, in that case where no investigation would be required to adjudicate whether the matter and form are present, the man has simply enrolled himself in another religion. Okay, that would suffice for notoriety of fact without the church having to make a judgment per se. However, under the current code of canon law, when it concerns a cleric who holds office in the church, even that notorious act, if you will, doesn't suffice for the loss of office, because under Canon 194.2, it says that the church must declare that the cleric has lost the office. So you see how stringent the church views these types of acts. So just be aware of that distinction. Notorious by law then would, generally mean the flip side, where he hasn't openly left, but he perseveres in his heresy, and the church comes in, gives him warnings, judges him, and then expels him through a declaration, an excommunication. That would be notorious by law. But just to clarify, there's some distinctions there as well.
Okay, so a cult is basically the matter and the form are joined together within. I'll use myself as an example. I don't know if that's impious, but let's say I both have the matter, which is the denial, then also the form, which is pertinacity, and that makes me an occult heretic, even if I sort of put it out on YouTube, or I, preach this in the center square, or I tell my wife about it, or my kids about it. It doesn't matter. That's still a cult.
It's still a cult. It would still be occult because even if you externally manifest your heresy, do you remain in external communion with the church? If you have, like you just described it, Christian, if you truly have committed the formal sin of heresy, here's where I think the body and soul distinctions by Bellarmine can come into play. You would have severed yourself from the soul of the church. And it's absolutely necessary for salvation to be united to the soul of the church for salvation, because you need the virtues of faith, hope, and charity in your soul at death, or you're going to hell. So if you're a occult heretic, you truly are a formal heretic who has severed himself from the soul of the church, and you're on your way to damnation. But you still haven't severed yourself from the body of the church, because you remain in external communion. Bellarmine actually, I think, went even overboard with this, because he even said, effectively, the Muslim or the Jew, that sits in the back of the pew but has no faith whatsoever, would still be part of the body of the church. I think that's excessive. I think that doesn't align with what other theologians have said, but there's some debate there. But I bring that up just to emphasize how high the bar is for one to be severed from the body of the church. You truly have to effectively join a non-Catholic sect, or at least somehow publicly renounce that the magisterium is no longer your rule of faith. That legal authority that brought you into the church is no longer your rule of faith. And Father Barry, says this. He says the profession of faith effectively resolves itself into a practical submission to the authority of the church. That's how Father Barry defines the profession of faith. And so, are you still in communion? Are you still in subjection to that authority? Okay, remember what I said about heresy. The heretic is primarily separated from the church, not because he has deviated from a dogma, which is the material element, but rather because he rejects the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. That's a heretic. So there's a difference there.
Yeah, so basically I become an occult heretic and even express it. And there's two ways that I could be cut off from the body. So one would be notorious by fact. If I go on here and say, the magisterium of the Catholic Church, I renounce any of its authority over me, and it's a human institution. Or if I go and become an Anglican again,
Right.
That would be notorious by fact. And then notorious by law is if my bishop finds out about whatever heresy I'm saying, and then they start a process of
Yeah.
rebuking me, and then I do not I do not repent of my error. So that would be notorious by law right there.
Yeah, that's generally how the commentators describe it. And so, for my Sedevacantis friends who claim that, well, John Salza always requires a declaration from the church, no, I actually don't. We are very clear in our book that one can separate oneself from the body through heresy by a notoriety of fact, and that would be openly departing and choosing another rule of the faith. I think, as Cardinal Bio says, it's one who no longer submits to the social magisterium. He has another rule of faith. The church doesn't need to declare that. But to my knowledge, neither Joe Biden or Melania Trump have come out and joined a non-Catholic religion or have said we are no longer Catholic. That's different. If they did that, I think we could say, yep, you guys are public heretics, because what you've done is notorious. What you've done suffices for the church to declare it without a further investigation. That's where you have heresy by a notoriety of fact. They've openly left. There's nothing else the church would need to do. And that point, you could say, yeah, that's a heretic. But that's a bad example, because those people haven't openly left the church.
Okay, so now, so do you think we laid the groundwork pretty well? Anything else to discuss before we continue?
I think, I wanted to mention, because I think you asked, Christian, what about, what's wrong with the private judgment, right? I mean, can a Catholic recognize if somebody's a heretic because they're saying, they don't believe in the Immaculate Conception? Well, if you look at the private judgment question, first of all the opinions of Bellarmine, that even the second opinion, which holds that if a pope were to secretly become a heretic, he'd lose the office. None of those opinions, and nowhere in the magisterium does it say that a Catholic can make that judgment and act upon that judgment. Now, number one, it's a matter of common sense, because the public authority by which an office is obtained is the same authority by which the office is lost. That's common sense. I mentioned how Bellarmine explains it when he's talking about, those who elect the Pope are those who also can participate in the Pope's deposition, so to speak. But this is magisterial, and I want to point this out as well. Not only is it common sense that I cannot make a public judgment concerning a public office, but it's magisterial. Pope Benedict XIV, he wrote an encyclical called Ex Quo in 1756. Well, he cites Pope Pelagius of the 6th century, who cites Augustine, who says whoever removes himself from communion with the prelates of the church are in schism. This has always been the case. Even where a Catholic has reason to believe that cleric or even bishops have lost the faith, they cannot separate from them, so to speak, in terms of saying they no longer hold office. I'm not subject to their authority. They still are lawful occupants. They still have lawful authority. The Fourth Council of Constantinople also comes to mind, which we mentioned in our book in 870, where the council condemned anyone who separated from his local bishop, his local patriarch, before a judgment of the church. And this was always in the context of people who were questioning whether their bishops deviated from the faith to an extent that they no longer had to be followed. I mean, I think the Sedevacantists would do well to read the Council of Constance condemnations of Wycliffe and Huss, for example, where the church says if the Pope is evil, if the Pope is a member of the devil, right, a member of the mystical body of the Antichrist, that he doesn't hold jurisdiction. And those propositions were anathemized. And I said it's common sense. It truly is. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, our favorite theologian, calls such judgments, such public judgments by private individuals who don't have the authority, he calls them judgments by usurpation, which is an improper judgment. And I want to mention there's been a recent error that's been pushed by Sedevacantists, among them the Vegas Sedevacantist priest, Father Paul Kramer, where he attempts to, make this distinction between a juridical judgment versus a private judgment. And of course, we recognize that distinction. But, he's out there claiming that a Catholic, by an act of his conscience, can make this judgment. And even though the church hasn't yet made the judgment, hopefully someday the church will catch up with our private judgment. But as a matter of conscience, if I believe this man's a heretic, I can separate from him. And that's totally wrong, because
That's
the
crazy.
conscience, as deals with deals with the practical intellect about what's right or wrong, right? It doesn't deal with the speculative intellect dealing with truth or error. So my conscience cannot tell me whether this man is the Pope or has lost his office for heresy. That's not a matter of conscience. So this is, laughable. It's frankly one of the latest errors that I see come out of the Sedevacantist camp. But clearly, our common sense should tell us, and the magisterium has told us, that this is not a matter for private judgment.
Okay, so I guess before we get into the 5 ways, are there any of to kind of distinguish what we mean in by heresy? Are there any of the 5 ways? I know I call them the 5 ways, the 5 positions. Are there any of the 5 positions that would say that the Pope is somehow deposed by occult heresy?
Well, there's some distinctions I think that we should walk through before we get into that detail. The answer to your question is yes. The second opinion, which is really the Sedevacantist position, is that if a pope falls into the sin of heresy, even if it's internal, he would lose the pontificate. I do want to make a few distinctions that may help the discussion, Christian. And all these distinctions revolve around, the truth that the Pope has no judge on earth, right? That the first see is judged by no one, right? And so this begs the question, well, if the Pope is judged by no one, how can the church possibly judge the Pope, right? This is where really all of the opinions, they were grappling with this question of, we recognize on the one hand, nobody judges the Pope, but on the other hand, if we have a heretic Pope, do we have a remedy? The distinctions I wanted to make is, number one, there's a distinction between the crime and the punishment. The crime is whereby the church would determine whether the Pope has committed the canonical crime of heresy. And this is important. That is what's called a discretionary judgment. It's a non-coercive judgment, because the church has no authority over the Pope. So Bellarmine and the rest of the theologians make a distinction between the church determining whether the elements of the crime have been committed without judging the Pope directly, only discerning the factual basis of whether all of the elements of heresy exist, and then the punishment, where once he falls from office, he can be punished. So there's a distinction between crime and punishment, discretionary and coercive, judge and depose. This is another important distinction. When you mention deposition in your sentence, a pope is never deposed. It can be judged whether he's committed the crime of heresy, but there's no coercive authority over him, so he can't be deposed until the heresy has been established. And we can get into the opinions which say that if the heresy is established, Christ is the one who severs him. He's no longer pope, then he can be punished. You see? So there's a lot of distinctions that have to come into play, and you need to understand those distinctions when you read the 5 opinions.
So I guess getting into the 5 opinions, what is the first opinion?
Yeah, the first opinion is that a pope can't become a heretic. It just can't happen. And Bellarmine actually personally held that opinion, although he said he recognized it wasn't the common opinion. And we can go through magisterial teaching about why that position is false. We've recently discovered a letter, I think, that the Sedevacantists said didn't exist, but there is a letter from Pope Clement to James that we found in the Latin, where Clement actually quotes Saint Peter himself, where Saint Peter, quoting Saint Peter, says to Clement, when he became Pope, Clement did. But during Peter's life, he says, if you teach things not pertaining to salvation, you could become deposed, deponaris in the Latin, meaning that the church has somehow a mechanism whereby it can judge whether you're a heretic, and if so, you can lose your office. This comes from St. Peter himself. If we want to believe the authenticity of Clement's letter to James, which I don't have any reason to believe it's not authentic, but this was also taught by a number of other popes. Pope Innocent, for example, the third, where if he says, if I commit a sin against the faith, he said, I may be judged. And then he goes on to say, he who does not believe is already judged. Now, the Sedevacantists will say, see, if he commits a sin against the faith, he's already judged. Well, what Innocent means by there is he's already been judged by God in the internal forum. It doesn't mean that he's already lost his office, because God's not going to secretly depose a pope without the entire church, knowing about it. So Pope Innocent held that he's already judged by God because God's judged him in the internal forum, and Innocent recognized that he can also be judged then in the external forum. You see, Saint Boniface, who became pope in that famous canon attributed to him, Si Papa, confirms that a pope can be a heretic. All the great scholars, Cajetan, Bellarmine, Suarez, John of St. Thomas, Liguori, all the way to Bio and Journet, they all held that a pope can be a heretic. So that's why we would reject the first opinion. I mentioned the second opinion is where the opinion whereby
so
go ahead.
Kind of stopping with the first.
Sure.
Could one hold the first with like a mix of another one? Just say, I don't think it's going to happen, but if it happens, then this will be
Bellarmine actually did that. It's funny that the Sedevacantists, they all refer to his great, multi-treatise volume set on the Roman Pontiff, De Romano Pontifice. Well, he was, trying to categorize all these opinions almost in passing. I mean, if you look at the volume of his work, he wasn't trying to give this full theological explication of it, like I think John of St. Thomas did. Mm-hmm. Can you? I think that's permissible, because I think it's erroneous when we talk about heresy. Is it heresy? Well, the church hasn't dogmatized this, so I think it's erroneous, but it's not heretical. But the fact that the church has declared Honorius, for example, a heretic, shows that the Pope can be a heretic. Well, we've already got examples of that. Marcellinus is another example. Liberius may be another example. Eugene IV, local council may be another example. There are other examples. And so I think to hold that position would be clearly an error, but you wouldn't be a non-Catholic for holding it.
Mm-hmm. So what is the second opinion now?
Yeah, the second opinion is the opinion that says the Pope would lose his office if he committed the sin of heresy. And this opinion's been long abandoned. Bellarmine refutes it specifically, as I said, because he refers to the fact that a man gains the pontificate through the cooperation of men. Well, he must also then lose the pontificate through the cooperation of men. It's a very reasonable argument. Of course, that's what happens. The Sedevacantists, even though they think they hold Bellarmine's fifth opinion, they don't. They actually hold the second opinion. They just don't realize it. Although their view of the second opinion might be modified a little bit, because that second opinion, holds the sin of heresy alone internally. I think the Sedevacantists, many would say, well, you need more than just the internal sin. You need an external manifestation of the heresy. So in fairness to the Sedevacantists, I would say they hold a modified view of the second opinion. But still, they're saying that it's the sin of heresy and not the canonical crime as determined by the church that causes the loss of office. And that's extremely problematic, because sin, is a matter of the internal forum. Mm-hmm. And the Roman Catholic Church is not an invisible church. It's not an invisible society. It's a visible society. And therefore, if one were to, be convicted of heresy, there has to be something visible by proper authority. So we don't go. I mean, think about it this way: if the sin of heresy alone severed you from the church, you wouldn't know who was really in the church. And St. Robert Bellarmine was clear. We have a right to infallibly know who's in the church, who is a cleric, who is a true bishop. We have a right to infallibly know that. And that's why, this idea of the sin of heresy causing people to be expelled from the body of the Christ is nonsense. It's not true. It supports this view of an invisible church. I mean, you wouldn't know whether your confessions in the sacrament of penance would be valid if you had a heretic priest absolving you. And so again, the church isn't invisible, and that's why the second opinion is erroneous.
Okay. So even within the second opinion, would they? How would they hold the relation that the average layman should hold to the Pope that they suspect might be a heretic? Do you know of any deeper reflection on this, or was this kind of just abandoned?
You went blank there for a while. I didn't hear the whole question, Christian. Can you repeat it?
Okay, yeah. So I was just asking whether those who hold to the second opinion, whether they ever went into detail into the second opinion, like how we ought to relate to a pope who we suspect of heresy or anything like that.
Yeah.
Did they even require any sort of judicial sentence, or were they kind of like Sedevacantists are?
No, yeah, that's a good question. If you look at the history of that opinion, think about the time that opinion was formulated. Even long before Bellarmine categorized these opinions, those who held that opinion, and I have a handful of them in my notes, believed that even though they held that the Pope would lose he'd be severed from the pontificate, he'd be out of the church, so to speak, there was still this issue of what about the external forum, right? How does that operate in the external forum? And some of the opinions that I've read who held this opinion said, we still have a conflict with the fact that if the church continues to recognize him as Pope, he must still be Pope, and they couldn't really reconcile that issue. There's also this doctrine of universal and peaceful acceptance, which says that it's a dogmatic fact if the church is still adhering to the man, even though he may have lost his office secretly. If the church is still externally adhering to them, then he wouldn't have technically held his office. So it's a little bit muddied there. Some others that were holding that opinion said, even though he may have been secretly deposed by Christ, if the heresy is not publicly endangering the faithful, think about back then when there was no internet and some Catholics didn't even know who the Pope was.
Yeah.
Some of the theologians said, communion with them would still be licit because the danger to the faith didn't exist. But there were so many problems with this, and it's hard for me to make the proper distinctions because, in my view, it was a very wishy-washy opinion. It wasn't really clear, and that's why it was abandoned a long time ago.
Mm. Yeah, and this actually leads to an interesting reflection, at least on my point. I've been wanting to do this in regard eventually to some research I've been doing into baptism of desire in the Baroque scholastics and their views of implicit faith and invincible ignorance and things like that, which are very much in line with what we say today, of course. Surprise, surprise, the church is indefectible. But interestingly, this leads to a very cool reflection that we could have on the nature of authority in theology, called De Locis Theologicis. So when we look at the way in which teachings are received among the theologians in theological schools, you can't go and point to a position as kind of like your own being held 600 years ago and say, well, it was held 600 years ago and everybody basically abandoned it, but we can kind of resurrect it from the dead because it's convenient during this time. Some people do this with Cajetan's view on baptism of desire in infants. Is just because somebody held to a view back then doesn't mean that you can take it and just bring it back to now because that would be interesting to bring it back. So we can very definitively say, no, this is we know this position is wrong. It's something which is an error in theology and has been rejected consistently within the schools for the better part of 500 years. This isn't like an open question of whether maybe the Pope, if he's an occult heretic, is actually going to he's actually going to lose the office, and maybe, you know, half of our popes haven't been real popes. That's not an open question for theologians to discuss.
And it's always been a theoretical and speculative question, right? When does the loss of office occur? There was always a general understanding that Christ is the one, you know, that joins the matter to the form, if you will. And so he's the one that also severs the matter from the form. But the question has always been, when does that happen? First of all, how do we determine whether the Pope's the heretic? And if the church does that, when does that fall happen? When does Christ act? Is it immediately upon, you know, the judgment that he's a heretic, or does something else have to happen, right? Because the church is a visible society, and the faithful have to know, you know, whether this is the Pope or not. So that's been a subject of speculation, and hasn't been worked out yet. The magisterium hasn't dogmatized any of this.
So what is because the first and the second, at least if I'm remembering the third, the fourth, and the fifth correctly, the first and the second make huge practical differences to the way in which we live in relation to the Pope. I mean, if the Pope could lose his office based on occult heresy, then that makes a huge practical difference for us in the way in which we actually pay very close attention to what the Pope is saying. Like, is he indicating that maybe he's privately holding a heretical position, or, you know, the first position, we just don't worry about it ever, and it's not a huge deal. But it seems to me, at least, that the third, the fourth, and the fifth, if I'm remembering them correctly off the top of my head, practically speaking, they're almost the same. Like, we would live in the same manner if the third was right, the fourth was right, or the fifth was right. It doesn't make much practical difference. It's just sort of more who's more speculatively consistent.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true with respect to the fourth and the fifth. I think the third, which is the opinion that a heretic pope cannot be judged by the church, is a bit different. This is actually an opinion that's held by Bishop Schneider, who's publicly stated that. I don't agree with that. Number one, I've mentioned the magisterial support for, you know, the position that the Pope can be a heretic. You know, Pope Clement, Pope Adrian, I didn't mention, Boniface, Innocent, etc. So the question is not whether the Pope can be a heretic and whether he can be judged a heretic, but really, you know, how does that work? And that's where the Dominican and Jesuit opinions, as Robert Sisko and I called it in our book, come into play. Because remember, this is a delicate question, because we also know that the Pope has no judge but Christ. He doesn't have any earthly authority that can coercively judge him on earth. And so the struggle with all these opinions, but most especially the fourth and the fifth, deal with that very question. The third opinion simply kind of throws in the towel that says, hey, since the Pope can't be judged, even if he is a heretic, we got to wait for him to die, because there's nothing we can do about it. Well, that fails to recognize the distinction which Bellarmine and Cajetan and John of St. Thomas and Suarez and Liguori and Bio and all the great minds that have addressed this make, which is the church, because of the power of the keys, and this is, I don't know if this is something I've mentioned before or not, but the power of the keys give the church the right to make judgments, you know, concerning knowledge and power or authority or jurisdiction. The clavis scientiae, which is the keys of knowledge, versus the clavis potentiae, which is the keys of power or jurisdiction. The keys of knowledge allow the church, without judging the Pope, to make a judgment as to whether the material and formal elements of the canonical crime of heresy exist. And Bellarmine is crystal clear about this. He calls it a discretionary judgment. And even John of St. Thomas, even St. Thomas himself refers to these two elements of the keys of knowledge and power. In terms of the key of knowledge, the church, because the church has a right to provide for her head, and because Scripture reveals that the church is supposed to avoid a heretic, that means the church would necessarily have the right under divine law to determine whether the Pope is a heretic. She does that without coercively judging the Pope by exercising the power of the keys, which the College of Bishops share in this case in determining whether the Pope is guilty of the canonical crime of heresy. Again, I want to emphasize this. This is not conciliarism. This is not elevating the bishops over the Pope. It's not the Pope being judged directly, but as John of St. Thomas says, the Pope is actually being judged indirectly because the church has a right to determine in a judgment whether the matter and form of heresy exist. It's a factual judgment, okay? Mm-hmm. Are the canonical crime elements of the crime of heresy present? The church has every right to do that. Bellarmine says one of the reasons why the College of Bishops could convoke a council even against the Pope's will is to provide for the head, to determine whether the Pope is a heretic. This is a divine right that Christ has given to the College of Bishops, and this is very consistent among all the commentators. And so you distinguish that discretionary judgment. And by the way, the Sedevacantists are keen to quote De Romano Pontifice on the Roman Pontiff, but I don't know if they've read his other works on the councils and on the Church Militant and on the marks of the church, because Bellarmine actually gets into more detail about when you can determine that a pope is a manifest heretic. And it's through the discretionary judgment, which Bellarmine says then leads to a conviction of heresy. Bellarmine specifically says, and we have an article, Cisco and I, on our website on this, Bellarmine says that the church can invoke an imperfect council if it's against the Pope's will and make a judgment discretionarily that the Pope is guilty of heresy. That is a conviction. Now, still, Christian, this is not a coercive judgment. This is only the exercise of the church's right to exercise the keys of knowledge to determine whether this man is a heretic. It's non-coercive. They're not judging the Pope, but because the church has a right to provide for the head, once it makes this determination, both Bellarmine and the Jesuits and the Dominicans recognize that Christ is the one who severs the bond. Okay, now, under the Jesuit opinion, I know we're not quite there yet, but in the Jesuit opinion, this would happen when the discretionary judgment is made and the Pope is convicted of heresy. Then, in the Jesuit opinion, Christ would sever the bond, and then the church, because he's no longer the Pope, can make a coercive judgment over him. You see, by excommunicating and deposing him. Overseeing his deposition and removal. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I wanted to tee that up because it's important as we discuss the fourth and the fifth opinion to recognize this distinction between a discretionary judgment, which is a judgment of the facts, which is non-coercive, and then and results in a conviction, and the coercive judgment, which then oversees the punishment and deposition of the former pope.
So that if I'm getting this correct, okay. So we have the Pope. I'll use a random Pope from history. I don't want to use Pope Francis, and I know that'll get clipped or something. I don't know. Pope Pius VII, let's say. So I don't know. I've never read anything about Pope Pius VII, so nothing personal against him. Pope Pius VII, he's an occult heretic, and he starts preaching different heretical things. Yeah. And then at this point, in order to go from occult and publicly expressing that to notorious by law, you would need somehow the intervention of the church. And in this process is through a sort of investigative process. Would it be like analogous to the way in which various investigators of a crime function and then bring it to prosecution versus like the actual, judgment of guilt in court? Like, is that kind of a good distinction to make between the two?
Yeah, although in the civil context, we have to remember that, the courts do have a coercive authority over the defendant. Although it's right to say that it's similar in that the jury doesn't, right? The jury is nothing more than a finder of fact and doesn't have coercive authority. But after they render the judgment, the judge then renders the sentence. So there is a similarity. There is a similarity there. But just stepping back a bit, again, I want to emphasize that the church has, these are opinions we're talking about. And I think the fourth and the fifth opinion are one of them is correct. And I tend to think the Dominicans got it right as usual. But the process is actually rooted, even though this hasn't been dogmatized, the process is rooted in Scripture, in divine law and revelation. Titus 3:10, St. Paul's letter to Titus, where he says after, two admonitions, warnings, avoid the heretic. And so the opinions which hold that the church has a right to judge whether the Pope is a heretic and then oversee his removal from office, both those opinions, even though they differ in actually how the process is completed, they all agree that the process has to start with ecclesiastical warnings, because that's the only way to establish the matter and the form, which are the elements of the canonical crime of heresy. And so, as Cardinal Burke called it, a formal correction. Well, I think he was referring to a warning. Now, in the context of the Holy Father, these would be warnings that are issued in fraternal correction. Again, they would not be juridically coercive over the Pope, and St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this as being warnings of fraternal correction, because inferiors have a right to, and even a duty to, warn their superiors when their salvation is at stake. So the church would issue ecclesiastical warnings, which would constitute warnings of fraternal correction, hopefully to get the Pope to repent. If the Pope would refuse, then the church has a right, and Bellarmine and John of St. Thomas are very clear about this. They would have a right to invoke what they call an imperfect council. John of St. Thomas goes into a lot of detail about this. Imperfect. It could be perfect if the Pope calls the council and agrees to it. It's imperfect if it's called against his will, but the church has a right to do that. After the warnings were not heeded, then the church has the right to issue this discretionary judgment, whereby it would, in Bellarmine's words, not my words, in Bellarmine's words, it would convict the Pope of heresy. And then the question becomes, what happens next? But my point, Christian, there is, in these two predominant opinions, they all agree that there is a process of warnings, ecclesiastical warnings from proper authority, that would lead to either the Pope's repentance or conviction. And we have an example of this with Pope Marcellinus in around 304 AD, where Marcellinus, and the circumstances are often debated, but the bottom line is he engaged in an act of false public worship. He offered incense to the pagan deity Jupiter. Okay. Putting the circumstances aside, he was called a heretic for that, and the bishops got together and summoned him to confront him about, this external act of heresy. And when you read this is a long time ago. This goes all the way back, into the 300s. But even back then, the church knew that they didn't have any juridical or coercive force over the Pope. So they told Marcellinus, "We do not judge you. Judge yourself. Judge yourself." And Marcellinus did judge himself and did resign in shame. But guess what happened? He repented. He was reelected to the throne of Peter and died a martyr, St. Marcellinus. So this is a beautiful example of where the process of ecclesiastical warnings and this imperfect counsel resulted in his repentance. But that's the process that all of the theologians agree to. Warnings based on revelation to establish the actual fact that the Pope is a heretic.
Okay, so once we get to the fact level, so Pius VII, let's say he's preaching something crazy about some dogma, and then there's so at this point, right, when we get to the preaching to the ecclesiastical fact-finding mission, is there any dispute that's going to go on with who finds the facts? Is it the cardinals, an ecumenical council, a local council?
Yeah.
Who are the fact finders? Because I can imagine that this question of whether this or that council or this or that body of individuals are allowed to have the authority. I can assume that this is going to be something
Right.
which is contentious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, some theologians have held that it would be the elector cardinals, but I think the more likely and predominant opinion is it would have to be an imperfect council, because an imperfect council will actually represent the universal church. Okay, and so that would be the distinction that I would make there, and I would say that because both Bellarmine and John of St. Thomas, said it, and they were kind of the two predominant theologians of their respective groups that addressed the question. So again, it's an opinion, but the opinion would have to be a representation of the universal church, because the Pope is the universal shepherd, and teacher of the entire church. And so an imperfect council, again, an opinion, but an imperfect council, meaning the Pope wouldn't be heading that council, would be required.
Yeah, I can imagine that this would, because I'm aware of Suarez's opinion that even a local council could do this, but I can imagine the difficulty that this would pose, because we could think about, a group of 20 bishops and 5 cardinals. Could they come out and then anathematize the Pope? And, how do we go here? It would seem like it would need to be some sort of council like Vatican II that has basically every bishop in the world there participating in this council, a vast moral majority of the bishops supporting this, and all the cardinals and everything like that. I could imagine that it would have to be something like that, even for it to be feasible.
I agree, and that's why I think Bellarmine held that position, and along with John of St. Thomas, a representation of the universal church.
So we have at this point, we have the ecclesiastical fact-finding mission, and they go in and they judge that there is this issue. So how do we get from that to now Pope is no longer Pope? Where this is where, unfortunately, our two great doctors, St. Robert Bellarmine and John of St. Thomas, depart from one another, is kind of these steps. Although, to clarify, as we've clarified before, the practical steps are basically the same. It's kind of a question of a more speculative matter of what happens between those 2 points.
Correct. So we've established that, and Cisco and I kind of came up with this distinction between Jesuit and Dominican opinion. To our knowledge, that wasn't out there. We just thought that was kind of a useful way to do it. And actually, I want to mention, when I wrote an article on Sedevacantism going on 10 years, as I was studying this for a very long time, I actually noticed, Christian, that while the Sedevacantists were saying that Bellarmine disagreed with Suarez on this, I didn't see that in the writings. And I had written an article on Sedevacantists, and I put a footnote in that article saying that they only held seemingly in opposite opinions, but they actually agreed with each other, even though not only all Sedevacantists, but other theologians like Werns and Badal and even De Silveira held that they differed in their opinion. They didn't understand Suarez's opinion and Bellarmine's opinion, at least on the question of the heretical Pope and when he loses his office. They were in complete agreement. They held that after the warnings and after the conviction, at that point, Christ would then depose the Pope. And Suarez is clear that after the conviction, there has to be a declaration to the church. And the Sedevacantists have said, well, Bellarmine never required a declaration. Suarez did. So Bellarmine disagrees with Suarez, and we're going to side with Bellarmine. That's not the case. Journet even says, and actually John of St. Thomas even says, that both Bellarmine and Suarez held that after the conviction, the church would have to declare that the Pope is incorrigible. Okay, so Bellarmine did hold that there has to be a declaration. After all, how would the church know about it if it wasn't declared. And when Bellarmine says that the Pope loses his office ipso facto without a judicial sentence, here's where we get into the misunderstanding that the Sedevacantists have. Bellarmine wasn't saying he loses his office without an antecedent judgment of the church. All of this is based upon the process of canonical warnings and a canonical conviction, okay, which is an antecedent judgment of the church that then results in Christ deposing the Pope. At that point, Bellarmine and Suarez and the Jesuits held that that's all that needed to happen. Once the conviction and declaration were rendered, Christ then, as the efficient cause, would come in and sever the bond at that point. The Dominicans were much more careful and much more nuanced. And I love how Cardinal Jornet says the Dominicans were more, their opinion is more penetrating. They were very careful about dealing with this delicate question of not wanting to judge the Pope. And so the Dominicans agree with the Jesuits. Cajetan and John of St. Thomas agree with Bellarmine and Suarez regarding the process of ecclesiastical warning, because after all, that's part of divine revelation. Avoid the heretic after the warnings, and the absolute requirement of the church to convict or to establish the fact of the crime and conviction of heresy. But whereas the Jesuits said at that point Christ comes and severs, and he therefore, by the fact, ipso facto, by the fact of what? By the fact of the church's antecedent judgment, which is a condition for the loss of his office, by the fact of the conviction, he loses his office without a further judicial sentence or juridical act. Bellarmine was arguing against Cajetan, who actually required an additional juridical act by the church. And what Cajetan and John of St. Thomas in great clarity and lucidity said is, because we want to be careful here about the church actually judging the Pope, we are not going to hold the Jesuit opinion, which says that the church judges or separates from the Pope. Let me put it that way. We hold the position that the Pope is actually separating on his own from the church. And they held Christian because after the conviction, they didn't believe Christ automatically severed the bond at that point. They believed that there was an extra step, a ministerial yet juridical step, whereby the church now has to communicate to the faithful that this man is a heretic and he must be avoided. And they base it on revelation. I mean, it's beautiful how the Dominicans have tied their opinion specifically to the plain meaning of the revealed scriptures. How does the church avoid the heretic Pope if it's not commanded to do so, right? So the church has to have an ability to understand if he's a heretic and that he must be avoided. So in the Dominican opinion, there's this extra step where the church issues what's called a vitandus declaration. It's a juridical act, not over the Pope, but it's a juridical act over the faithful, telling the faithful, you must avoid the Pope as a heretic. And the way John of St. Thomas, explains it in beautiful Dominican theology, he says, here's where the church acts upon directly upon the matter, but not the form. The matter is the man and the form is the pontificate. What John of St. Thomas says is, by declaring to the church that this man must be avoided, we're not coercively judging this man. We're telling you to avoid the Pope, the fallen Pope. It's by that declaration of avoiding him that renders the man impotent to govern the church. Mm-hmm. So the declaration renders him impotent or unable to carry the form of the pontificate. And that's, under the Dominican opinion, where Christ then severs the bond. And the Dominican theologians often use, procreation and death as an example, where the generative act of procreation, that doesn't create the form, right, of man. It doesn't create the soul, and neither does death directly touch the form or the soul. The matter is simply incapable of sustaining the form. And so the vitandus declaration of the Dominican opinion renders the matter incapable of sustaining the form. It renders the Pope incapable of governing as Pope of the pontificate. And so you see that subtle but most beautiful distinction there, where the church's conviction is only the dispositive cause of the Pope's falling, just like the cardinal electors and the Pope's consent of accepting the pontificate is the dispositive cause of his election. It's Christ who joins the matter in the form, and it's Christ who severs the matter in the form. So sorry for the long-winded discussion, but it's important to note that there are subtle distinctions here, but none of this helps Sedevacantists, because all of this is done under the authority of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't have said it better myself. I had a few things in my mind, because I remember first reading John of St. Thomas on this, and I was truly, for the first time, I read something on this issue, and it was just like things clicked. Yeah. And I was like, of course, when there's a contrary form, which is somehow placed in a certain agent, accidental form, of course, placed in a certain agent, then the severing of the matter and form occurs, because there's a certain disposing within the matter. So just reading that, I was like, yeah, of course this happens. I mean, you shoot somebody's body, they die. It's just that simple. You elect somebody, they become Pope. The church has no authority over the Pope in this case.
Yeah.
But it's just, when I read it, I was like, this made sense. This made sense. This made sense. And your explanation just hit every single point that I was going to bring up. So there's literally nothing for me to say.
That's great. That's great. I mean, that's the position I hold. I mean, I think it's most faithful to Revelation. Saint Robert Bellarmine was a great doctor and theologian of the church, but frankly, he got some things, I think, wrong on this. I mean, if you look at Bellarmine's refutation of Cajetan in De Romano Pontifice, Bellarmine argues against a straw man. He is basically arguing against Cajetan because he thinks Cajetan believed that a pope who loses the virtue of faith loses the office. That's not what Cajetan believed, and yet Bellarmine was making it sound as if that was Cajetan's opinion. So there are things in Bellarmine's teachings that are quite confusing. But having said that, it's permissible to hold that opinion. I mean, there's no question. I just think that the Dominicans got it right, because there would seem to me to be, after the conviction, this necessary step of communicating this to the church and telling the church that you must avoid this man, that he is a heretic. That follows St. Paul's instructions to a T. And so the way that Cisco and I described in our book, we say in the Jesuit opinion, the Pope separates from the church, and in the Dominican opinion, it's really the church separating from the Pope, rendering him impotent, rendering the matter of incapable of sustaining the form. And that's in line with what Cajetan and John of St. Thomas taught.
Okay, I thought we could transfer into some of the questions, unless you had anything else that you thought was vital to add.
No, I think we covered it, Christian. We can go to questions if you'd like.
Okay, so the first question is from Bellarmite. Could magisterial documents contain degrees of error in them? Bellarmine seems to suggest that a pope could err due to the lack of love and ignorance, but not faith, in Book 1, Chapter 10. Pope Vigilius seems to suggest this as well.
Could magisterial documents contain degrees of error? Yes, and we have historical proof that that's the case. We know, even based upon the Church's profession of faith, that while the first two categories cannot contain error, it's impossible. Those would be considered infallible teachings to which we assent by faith. There are other things in magisterial documents that may be subject to error. And when I say that, we have to distinguish. This is something that's often overlooked. If the Pope is talking about, energy efficiency in an encyclical, that wouldn't even be considered doctrine. That's not even considered teaching, right? So there's a distinction between doctrine and non-doctrine. Certainly non-doctrine, that's up for grabs. That can have all kinds of error. But even doctrinal statements, which are not presented to us either as revealed truths or to be definitively held, we can say, based upon historical examples, and I can give a number of them, there could contain error. Now, is that common? No. I want to be careful about that. I'm just saying theoretically, yes, because the way the profession states it is that third categories, are exercises of the authentic magisterium, which require a religious submission of intellect and will. Okay, not an assent of faith. So that tells me that's conditional, theoretically anyway. It's conditional, and there have been commentaries that said if somebody's well read, they may see a conflict between a non-binding teaching versus a prior binding teaching. Okay, fine. Maybe there's room to suspend judgment there. But again, we wouldn't say that one can publicly dissent from the teachings of the magisterium. That's a different issue. So it's a kind of a long answer, but I wanted to cover a number of things that come to my mind with that. Historically, there have been cases of error, but it's not common. And I wouldn't even consider those issues that the Sedevacantists bring up with Vatican II to be in that category, because many of those things can be very clearly reconciled, some easier than others. But yes, the answer, although I wouldn't say it's common.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with the next question, is the church and I wanted to bring this question because Sedevacantists always ask this, and I think there's an important distinction that we can make. Is the church the congregation of all of those who claim to be Catholic or those who profess the same faith?
Well, Bellarmine actually would agree with those who claim to be Catholic. We have quotes from him which say those Catholics are those who gather and claim themselves to be Catholic. It's a little more precise than that. A Catholic is one who has been lawfully received by the church's authority into the church and hasn't openly left or been cut off, as I've been saying on and on, right? So that's a Catholic. We profess the true faith by virtue of the juridical bond that's formed in our baptism. Okay, it's not that Christian and I can, with perfection, articulate all the dogmas of the faith. I mean, we might screw that up, and we might do so even in a quasi official capacity on a podcast or something like that, or even teaching in a university. But no, that those who profess the true faith, that's what the Protestants say the church is. Remember that. All of the Protestant revolters said that Rome has lost the faith. We profess the true faith. The true church is visible only in those body of believers who profess the true faith. That is not Catholic ecclesiology. So the church, the congregation of those who profess the true faith, that's not the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is composed of those who are juridically united to the church in faith, worship, and governance. And that is united to the Church of Rome and all of the dioceses and equivalents united to her. That's the Catholic faith, Catholic Church.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting about this question is this fails to make a very fundamental distinction that I often have to bring up with Protestants. And this is the distinction between dogmas and articles of the faith. Because a lot of times they'll say, well, are you telling me some random, lay person in the 7th century was articulating transubstantiation or anything like that? And it's no, I'm sure most Catholics today wouldn't be able to articulate it.
Right.
And while that certainly makes them material heretics if they're denying certain aspects of the dogma, that doesn't mean that they don't assent to the faith, because this sort of minimum requirement for assenting to the faith. I mean, even certain authors. I was reading the Samontacenses, the Carmelites at Salamanca. I was reading them earlier today, and they basically said it's common in the schools amongst all the authors to basically say that belief in the Trinity and Incarnation is basically enough. And even some will say that catechumens, before they're instructed on the Trinity and even the Incarnation, actually could still have the faith. So
great point.
Faith is used in many senses. So to ask a simplistic question like this is it all who claim to be Catholic or all who profess the same faith? Just shows a sort of fundamental confusion on the history of of Catholic theology on this, going back centuries. This isn't a
Centuries. Great point, Christian. I mean, there were theologians that held only in the two credibles. I believe in God and the fact that he, rewards the just and punishes the wicked. St. Thomas came along and said, well, no, you also need explicit faith in the Trinity and the Incarnation. Okay, so now we have four credibles. But when you read St. Thomas's teaching on the virtue of faith or the habit of faith, he says one has the habit who believes or is disposed to or willing to believe all that exists, even though he currently doesn't. He still has the virtue of faith. And that shows that those who haven't been formally received into the church by a grace of God could still be united to the soul of the church because they're not in mortal sin and they are properly disposed to believing, in everything that the church teaches, even if they don't understand it, right? So there's that distinction that you mentioned earlier on baptism of desire and being united to the church either in re, actually, or in voto, in will, right? So that's a great example of how you don't need to, profess the true faith in terms of the material aspects of the faith, but only that internally you're properly disposed to believe all that God's revealed, and that's to the soul of the church, and externally you've been received into the church by lawful authority.
Yeah, I was literally just this morning reading the Sedevacantism on this, and it's absolutely like brutal to this type of reasoning that the Sedevacantists also bring. And I mean, I've one quote that that even mentions, like, in the same sentence, implicit faith, baptism of desire, and in something else that Sedevacantists don't like. But if some people who have a knowledge of theology from that era will just tell you, yeah, these were just kind of common opinions. There wasn't huge amounts of controversy around these questions of things like implicit faith or invincible ignorance or questions like that. There wasn't a huge amount of controversy. Right. So really, the Feeneites are the ones who are novel with their opinions. They're completely making things up from very infantile reasoning, which even the Sedevacantists mentioned actually Florence in there, and how some theologians, a very minority group of theologians, were bringing up, well, Florence says this, and the Sedevacantists said, well, Trent actually excludes your reading, and then points to a section in Trent.
Yeah,
but it's just all interesting how modern, I guess you could say, the discussions that they were having back then, and how the church is indefectible. Sorry, guys, you can right. you can say whatever you want, but when you look back into the history, the Catholic faith is over and over and over again vindicated.
Always vindicated. I mean, St. Paul's use of the word baptisms in the plural in his letter to the Hebrews, all the way to Augustine, all the way to the medievals, Aquinas, and on and on and on. Baptism of desire. The Feeneites, as you mentioned, total perversion of what has always been taught. They effectively believe, even though I don't think a lot of them understand this, they effectively believe that one needs the baptismal character on the soul to get to heaven. That's ultimately what their position comes down to. And they make a distinction, which is an erroneous distinction, between justification and salvation, because they will be forced to acknowledge that the Council of Trent clearly taught a man can be justified, by the baptism or desire for baptism. Well, then they have to say, well, there's a distinction between that kind of justification and ultimate salvation. And you get ultimate salvation by the water, okay, not the desire, which effectively boils down to needing the baptismal character for salvation. But, as our favorite theologian taught, the baptismal character is ordered to divine worship on earth. It's ordered to the ability to licitly and fruitfully receive the sacraments on earth. It's not some portal to get into heaven, even though, we want everybody to be baptized. Christ himself said, baptize all the nations. But what I'm saying is one cannot preclude those from not having received water baptism to necessarily be, in damnation, if in fact somehow through the grace of God, they have the virtue of faith and truly have the habit of wanting to believe everything God has revealed, even whether they know the church or not. It depends upon that mysterious and unique disposition of the soul that only God knows. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it does kind of play into this argument a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next one, who was the Pope during the Great Western Schism, and was he formally deposed by the Council of Constance?
Well, there were a bunch. There was a line of popes in Avignon and Pisa, and then later in Rome. I mean, you had Benedict the 13th, you had Clement the 12th. I'm forgetting some of the other names, but no, they weren't formally deposed in the way of the church exercising authority over a true pope. What happened there is you had one pope resign, another pope refused to resign. They called the Council of Constance, and then the pope submitted to the resignation, and then a new pope was elected. And I'm trying to remember all the names of this and how this played out. You had Saint Catherine siding with actually the true pope, and Vincent Ferrer with the false pope. But you can't use the Great Western Schism as a good example of the juridical process of determining whether a pope's a heretic, because that wasn't the question during the Great Western Schism. The question was whether who was the true pope, and the church had to deal with that specific question by calling a council, which again shows that the church has the right to provide for its head. When there is a confusion about who is the pope and all that kinds of chaos, the church has a right to make a definitive decision on that. There was a true pope and there were false popes, and Christ then led the church into, calling the Council Constance and settling the matter once and for all. So it is an example of the church providing for the head in the case of crisis, although it's not really parallel to the heretical pope that we've been discussing.
Okay, then we also have a question about what you think about the SSPX. Are they still in schism? And if yes, what would it take for them to be reconciled?
Well, yes, I think that the definition of schism is a refusal of submission to the authority of the Holy Father, or refusing communion with those subject to him. The fact of the matter is, although the declared censure of excommunication was lifted, the society, as an enterprise, still willfully remains separate from the church's governance. In fact, faith, worship, and governance, but governance most notably, even though they were given conditions for their integration into the church, which I think is so unfortunate, because as I've said all along, we'd love to have them in the church with a canonical mission. But given their refusal to accept the conditions for integration, to me that shows a refusal of submission to the Holy Father. And even more striking, I think, is the fact that the society itself would say they're not in communion with 99.9% of the Latin Church, because they reject the Novus Ordo and all the reforms that followed it. And so you have a real problem there. Benedict lifted the excommunications, and he explained why. He said he wanted prompt attainment of full communion, which didn't happen. And so, although it's not exactly similar, people should understand that even though a declared censure is lifted, does not mean that the movement itself isn't schismatic, nor does it mean that those who formally adhere to the movement are not schismatic themselves. After all, the Orthodox are also, by their own willful refusal, not in subjection to the authority of the Roman Pontiff. Well, Paul VI lifted their censure of excommunication in 1965, and yet the society would be the first to call them schismatics, you see. So I do believe that the schism persists, and continue to pray that at some point there will be a reconciliation. But I think until they submit themselves to the authority of the Pope and the bishops, they remain in schism.
Okay. So for last question, what are your thoughts on the Jesuits?
What century?
I mean, I personally, my favorite book is a brief guide to mental prayer according to the mind of Saint Ignatius. I have a huge devotion to Saint Ignatius.
Awesome.
And I think their spirituality is, and in this, there's been essays on this, which are very fascinating to me. But the spirituality of Saint Ignatius seems to actually flow from some of what he had studied as a student from Saint Thomas. And it seems like Saint Ignatius held to a very Thomistic view of grace and predestination. So in that sense, I think Ignatian spirituality is certainly a working out thanks to the Dominicans. So the Jesuits can thank the Dominicans.
Gosh, you sound like me. I love Ignatian spirituality too. I have the same book. I have books by St. Ignatius, and all of those fundamental things of how to grow in grace and virtue and avoid sin. But you're right; they get a lot of it from St. Thomas. Even Bellarmine claimed, he was following Thomas. The Jesuits were claiming they knew Thomas, just like the Molinists claim that they follow St. Thomas, just like the Calvinists say we believe in a lot of what St. Thomas taught. So it seems like we have all these differing opinions, and yet they're all pointing to St. Thomas, right? So that's why Christ gave us a church. I think St. Thomas got it right, and I defer to him, but that's why we have a church. He has the ultimate say.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was actually a period as well before Florence, Council of Florence, where the Orthodox themselves were claiming to agree with St. Thomas.
Yes, that's right.
They said he just messed up a little bit on the filioque and the papacy thing, but other than that, we're in agreement. Yeah. So thank you, John. This was great. So where can people find, if they want to read a sort of full treatment of this question, where can they get your book, your website, and things like that?
Thanks, Christian. trueorfalsepope.com, trueorfalsepope.com. You can contact me there by email as well. The book is available in electronic format at an extremely reasonable price, I think of $9.99, 800-page treatise. My co-author and I, Robert Sisko, we've got another 400 pages. We just haven't released a second edition yet. We've been working on other projects, but we actually have another 400 pages of ecclesiology that beefs up the first 4 chapters. And the book's 20 chapters, and we have so much more to say, which just confirms everything we've written. We have found additional writings from St. Bellarmine that we've had translated from the original Latin texts, along with Cajetan, Suarez, John of St. Thomas, and others, Father Lehman. Who else do we have? Lehman, Ballarini, Cardacchini, all kinds of great theologians. Warrens and Vandal are more modern, but the ecclesiology is really, in my view, what is so critical to understanding how to navigate the current crisis. What is the Catholic Church? It is not, just those who profess the true faith. That is a dangerous ecclesiology. That's what the Protestants said. We need to be, in hierarchical communion with the Pope and the bishops and under their authority. And again, if we think that we're not required to obey sinful commands and error, but we need to be in subjection to those that Christ have put over us. So, for my articles, trueorfalsepope.com. The book can be there. We write articles regularly on these topics, specifically on matters of ecclesiology, heresy, the current modern errors that are afflicting the church, and we're happy for those to visit the site.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you everybody else for watching. Make sure to remember to like, subscribe, comment, and I think this is a good introduction for a lot of this video is a good introduction if you have those who are curious towards Sedevacantism. We didn't really get into the Sedeprivationist question, but maybe that would be a cool follow-up to briefly discuss that. But yeah, this would be a good just show to introduce individuals who are interested to. So definitely send it to those people. So thank you, John, and everyone else. God bless.